Welcome back to Alpha Summit Europe, Middle East and Africa. This is day 2 of our exciting event. If this is, though, your first day of joining us, then I welcome you on behalf of CFA Institute. My name is Louise Cooper, and I'm delighted to be your host. Yesterday, we heard from leading experts talking about capital allocation, infrastructure investments, private markets, emerging and frontier markets, as well as how to appraise corporate culture as an input to stock valuation. Now, if you missed any of these sessions, many are now available on demand on the platform under the agenda section. Just click on the day, click on the session, and the video should pop up automatically. And we have another informative and interesting itinerary ahead of us today. We'll explore a wide range of topics, including climate investment opportunities, sustainability analytics, geopolitical risks, and there's a lot of those around at the moment, and the resiliency of capital markets in a post-pandemic world. So let's get started. Our opening session is relevant to all of us, and especially to those of us who are students of behavioural economics. The session is titled simply, Why People Make Bad Judgments and How to Make Better Ones. And I am so looking forward to this. Here to introduce our next speaker is our moderator, Susan Spinner, CFA, and CEO of CFA Society Germany. Susan, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Louise. It's a pleasure to be here, and hello, everyone. Where there is judgment, there is noise. We've heard a lot in recent years about bias and how bias leads to errors in judgment, and that can lead to bad decision-making. But inferiority of judgment through noise is a newer concept, but one which we are about to all hear quite a bit more about in the next half hour or so from our expert speaker, Olivier Sibony. He's a professor and senior consultant. He's also the author of 4 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment. And this book was co-authored by Daniel Kahneman and Cass Sunstein. Welcome, Olivier. And before I hand over to Professor Sibony, if I may please encourage everyone to ask questions. Please do so by putting them into the question box and do not use the chat tool. So, Olivier, I'm really looking forward to your presentation and then, of course, also to the Q&A afterwards. So I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to address a group of people whose judgments are so important to their clients and to society. And judgment is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about what arguably is the most important skill, the most important thing you bring to your jobs every day, which is the quality of your judgment. And we're going to explore a flaw in that judgment, not in your judgment or my judgment, but in human judgment in general, in what makes us capable of making those judgments. If we can start showing the slides, perhaps, which I guess we should be seeing now. Thank you. Let's start with a very simple question. Suppose that you are in an insurance company, in a very good insurance company, a well-run insurance company, and you take a group of professionals, for instance, underwriters who set the premiums that customers will have to pay for a complex insurance policy. And suppose that all those underwriters are highly qualified experts who are using the tools and the techniques of their trade and who are, of course, using the practices and the norms and the methods of their company. And you give 2 of these underwriters exactly the same case. On average, if you repeat this experiment a number of times, how much difference do you think you would expect to find between the premiums set by 2 underwriters, randomly selected? Now, we could do a poll and get your opinions, but since we've actually had this poll in lots of fora before, we know that the number that is coming to your mind is probably something in the region of 10%. The number that we expect the difference to be is about 10%, and that's also incidentally what the leaders of that insurance company told us when we did the experiment they expected and they would in fact find tolerable, because after all, these people aren't machines. They are making judgments. Trouble is, when we actually did the experiment, we found that the real number is not 10%, it's 55%. There is a lot more variability in those experts' judgments than the experts themselves, than the experts' bosses, or than anyone observing this, including the customers of the insurance company, would have expected. This is the basic idea of noise. There is a lot more variability, a lot more noise in human judgment than we think. Now, to clarify something very important and set aside a concern that you're probably having as you listen to this, variability is not always bad. There are a lot of situations where variation, where diversity is beneficial or at least harmless. If we have different tastes, if you prefer modern art and I prefer Vermeer, that's fine. That's a matter of taste. If we are looking for technological solutions to a technological challenge and you take one route and I take another, that's fine, because in the end we'll see what works. If we are competing in markets, if one investment firm thinks that an investment is worth X and another one thinks it's worth Y, well, we're going to find out, because the market is going to decide in the end whether X was right to sell and Y was right not to sell. So when there is a market, when variation is going to be followed by selection, either by what works technologically or by what works in the market, variation is fine. And that's a mental model that we have a lot. We expect that variation is always fine because markets will sort the problem out. Unfortunately, when you work in an organization, or more broadly in a system, that is not the case, because systems do not correct or do not decide effectively what the correct answer is. For instance, I gave you the example of the insurance company. There are many other examples that we all use every day where we make judgments in which variability is not desirable, it is noise. When doctors make diagnoses, you do not expect two different doctors to make different diagnoses. You wouldn't call this diversity or creativity. You would say one of them, at least, is in error. If you are looking at college admissions and the decision to admit or not to admit the same applicant is a function of which particular admissions officer happens to be looking at that person's case, we would probably all say that is a problem. Of course, if you are hiring people, and again, the decision to hire or not to hire depends on the happenstance of who you happen to be meeting that day, or if you happen to be in court and the decision you get happens to be a function of the particular judge who happens to be present that day, we would say that's a problem. Noise is a problem, variability is a problem, variability is undesirable in all those situations where we believe there is a correct answer and we try hard to find it, even though, of course, we don't know it, otherwise it wouldn't be a matter of judgment, but we try hard to get as close as possible to the best possible answer, and where we expect professionals, just as in the underwriting department of the insurance company, not to agree exactly, but at least to be in bounded disagreement. That's where noise is a problem. Now that we've defined noise, I have three things to tell you about this serious problem in human judgment. First, wherever there is judgment, there is going to be noise. Second, wherever there is noise, it is actually costly, it is a serious problem. And third, you can do something about it and improve the quality of your judgment. So let's go very quickly through those three topics so that we have time for your questions. And please do send Susan your questions in the Q&A throughout the talk. Don't wait until the end, because I'm sure there will be a lot. First of all, wherever there is judgment, there is noise, and more of it than you think. Let's step back for a second and remember something that we're all familiar with: bias. What's the difference between noise and bias, and how would we know that there is noise? There is a visual image that can help you think about this. Suppose that five friends are sharing a gun at a shooting range and trying to hit the bullseye. And as you can see in this picture here, they are doing a pretty good job. They're all hitting the bullseye. Now, bias is when you see something like this. They're all shooting, they're all missing the bullseye, but they're all missing the bullseye in the same way. And when you look at this, something immediately comes to your mind. There must be a reason. There must be something wrong with the gun sight, or maybe the wind is blowing really hard in the direction of the southwest of the center. there is something that must be a common explanation for those errors. It can't just be random error. If, on the other hand, you saw something like this, you would say, well, I guess this team is not a team of marksmen. They are not great shooters, but there is nothing inherently surprising about this. On average, they are hitting the bullseye. In fact, one of them hits the bullseye. There is just noise there. That's the difference between bias and noise. Bias is a shared error. Bias is a mistake that goes in the same direction and that everybody, or most everybody, makes all the time, or mostly all the time, in the same direction. Noise, on the other hand, is unpredictable and does not call for an obvious explanation. Now, of course, the two can combine. You can, and you often do when you make experiments, find that there is both bias and noise. If you look at the target D here, you can visually imagine where the barycenter of those hits is. It is close to where it is in target B, but you also have dispersion around that center. That is the combination of noise and bias. Now, you're probably not interested in target shooting. You're more interested in professional judgments. How does noise manifest itself, other than in the insurance company that we've already seen, in human judgments that you make every day? One striking example would be talent management. In hiring decisions, in performance management decisions, we have considerable evidence that there is a large amount of noise. Whether you happen to get a job or whether your firm happens to give a job depends on the chance that determines what person sees the candidate, the lottery essentially that determines what person sees the candidate, and probably also a second lottery that determines whether that person is hitting it off with the candidate, is in a good mood. We all know that we have rules and procedures and forms and standards and criteria that we use. Despite all that, there is a lot of variability. We're going to see later how we can reduce it, but there is a lot of variability. The same is true of performance ratings. When you look at something arguably even more consequential, criminal justice, there have actually been studies quite a while ago, and they are repeated from time to time. But the largest one is the one whose results are described here, which asked 200 different judges, 208 judges to be precise, to look at a number of cases, 16 different cases, for which they were given exactly the same facts. So just to be clear, this isn't about different judges giving different punishments to similar cases and taking into account the circumstances of the case. This is about judges giving different sentences to exactly the same defendants in the same cases about the same crimes committed against the same victims in the same circumstances. These are situations, artificially created, of course, in which the only thing that varies is the identity of the judge. How much does it vary? For an average sentence of 7 years, the mean difference between two randomly chosen judges would be close to 4 years. That's the difference between getting a sentence of 5 years and getting a sentence of 9 years. That's the mean. In fact, when you look at the spread, for the same crime, some judges give a punishment of 1 year and some give a life sentence. Whether you get a punishment of 1 year in prison or a life sentence should probably not be the result of a lottery. Unfortunately, it is. Where do all these variations come from? You're probably thinking of one already. You're probably thinking of one component of noise, which is intuitive, which is the fact that some of these judges, if we take the example of judges again, are more severe than others. Maybe some have deep political beliefs that it's very important to punish crime severely, whereas others are believers in redemption and giving people a second chance. So on average, across all 16 cases that we've asked them to look at, some of the judges are going to be more severe and others are going to be harsher, less harsh. That's what we call level noise. It's the difference in the average judgments. And we can all understand that. My students know that some professors are harsh graders and others are lenient graders, and everybody knows that. It's relatively easy to understand. It's relatively easy to fix if you want to fix it. That's component number one. Component number two is the fact that, in fact, if you give the same judge the same case on two different occasions, they will not judge it identically. Now, in fact, if they remember the case, they will judge it identically. But if they don't, they will make different judgments. And the reason we know that is because we can take very large numbers of studies and measure experimentally, using econometric techniques, measure the effect that features of the occasion that should not influence the decision have on the decision. For instance, we can look at the effect of the temperature, the outside temperature. It turns out that when it's very hot out there, judges are more severe on average. So we can bet that if the same judge had forgotten about a case that she saw a few months ago or a few years ago and was faced exactly with the same case on a much hotter day, the sentence would tend to be more severe. We think that our brains are machines that are capable of replicating perfectly the gestures that they are performing, but just like this gentleman aiming at the bin here, we never repeat exactly the same gesture twice in our minds. We are subject to occasion noise, the variability of our judgments from one occasion to the next. And we think that's all, right? We think that once we said that some judges are more severe than others on average, and that some judges are more severe on some days than on other days, that should explain everything. That's what we thought for a while when we were working on this project together with Daniel Kahneman and Kesten's team. And then we realized that we were actually missing the biggest chunk of noise. The largest chunk of noise is what we call pattern noise. Pattern noise is the difference in tastes. If you look at those judges, some of them will find some crimes particularly offensive, but others will not find the same crimes terribly offensive. Others might be sensitive to something completely different. Basically, what matters to them, what evokes strong feelings in them, is not always the same thing from one judge to the next. Basically, if you want to put it differently and more simply, we are all different. And because we are all different, our judgments are going to be different, especially if you view them as a chance to express our individuality. But even if we try to follow the rules and the principles that have been given to us by our organization or by the judicial system in the example of the judges, we will inject some of our lives, of our experiences, of our personalities in those judgments, and therefore we are going to make them more different from other people's judgments than we suspect. We think others think like we do, but in fact, we don't think like they do. And when we think that we are different from them, we view it as a good thing. But when we think that their judgments are different from ours, we suspect that they must be wrong. That's the problem of pattern noise. So we have those three types of noise, and the three types of noise add up to a lot of variability in judgments that should be identical or at least fairly close to one another. The first idea was wherever there is judgment, there is noise, for those three reasons. The second idea that I wanted to cover with you is that wherever we care about accuracy, and I know that to those who are listening today, it is actually a very important topic, accuracy. Wherever we care about the truth, about an accurate representation of reality, noise is costly, and we tend to neglect it. First of all, when we talk about noise, people often have this misconception that noise is not as important as bias because on average it cancels out. And of course, that is correct. We've just defined noise not as the average error, that would be bias, but as the variability around the average error. So on average, noise doesn't matter. The problem, of course, is that we don't live on average. If on average your doctor diagnoses the right number of cancers, but he misses yours, and he incorrectly diagnoses cancer in someone who does not have cancer, you're not saying that on average the doctor is right. You'll be saying that the doctor made two costly mistakes. When you're always wrong and on average right, you're not on average right. When you're always wrong, noise is a problem. We care about individual judgments, not just about the average of judgments. So that's the first misconception we need to dispel. Noise matters, even though it mathematically does not seem to when we look at the average of judgments. In fact, the mathematically correct way of thinking about this is not to say that noise cancels on average. It's to say that error is what we should care about, and that error is the sum of bias and noise. More precisely, error in the way that is measured by statisticians since at least Gauss, and in the way that it is measured by scientists in all the sciences, natural and social, is mean squared error. And mean squared error is the sum of the squares of bias and noise. We call this the error equation, and I don't mean to bore you with equations. If you have a statistical background, this is obvious to you, and if you don't, I don't want to bore you with statistics. The only reason I'm showing this is to show you that bias and noise play exactly the same role in this equation. If you increase bias by one unit, it will increase mean squared error. If you increase noise by 1 unit, it will increase mean squared error in the same amount. Error is bias plus noise, and bias and noise play the same role in the determination of overall error, which implies that reducing noise should be as valuable and as important and as much as a priority as reducing bias. And yet, we are not paying as much attention to it. This is the mathematical way. There is another way to think about why noise is damaging, and it's more simple. Why is noise damaging? First, because the judicial example showed it to you, it's a matter of fairness. Similarly situated people should be treated similarly. When judges give very different sentences to defendants that are identical in the experiment that we talked about, or close to being identical in real life, that's a problem of fairness. If different candidates who are applying for jobs at your firms are identical or close to identical or similar in their performance and skills, and they are treated differently, that's a problem of fairness. We are very sensitive to this problem of fairness when it's a problem of bias. When we say one person was treated differently because she is of one particular background or race or gender identity, and another person was treated differently, we say that's outrageous, and we're right. But when this unfairness is the product of what appears to be a random factor, or the interaction between the person making the judgment and the person who is the recipient of the judgment, we are somehow not as offended. We should be, because it's just as unfair to be mistreated because of bad luck as it is to be mistreated because of some identifiable bias. So noise is damaging for reasons of fairness. Second, noise is damaging because it hurts the credibility of the organization. Let's go back to the insurance company example. If one applicant for an insurance policy gets told that they will have to pay $80,000, and another one who has exactly the same request is told by another underwriter at the same insurance company that they will have to pay $140,000, and these two customers happen to speak to each other, the insurance company is going to have a problem. We all experience this, by the way, when we deal with a bureaucratic administration and we have the impression that the decisions of the functionaries are arbitrary. It hurts the credibility of the bureaucracy. So fairness is a problem, credibility is a problem, and of course, mathematically speaking, error is a problem. Noise creates error just as much as bias does. Noise is always damaging. Noise is always something we should care about. Wherever accuracy matters, noise is costly, and we should do something about it. Which, of course, begs the question of what we can do about it. And here's the good news. Wherever there is noise, it can be reduced, and what you're going to do to reduce noise may, in fact, help you reduce bias too. Here's why. Suppose again that you're at the shooting range, and you are looking at two of the targets that we looked at, the noisy target and the noisy and biased target. Now, we know that one is noisy and the other is noisy and biased because we know that where the bullseye is. We know that people on the D team are missing the bullseye on average, whereas people on the C team are missing the bullseye each time, but centered around the bullseye on average. Suppose that, in fact, you are not looking at the target, but looking at the back of the target. All you see is this cluster of hits, but now you don't know whether Team C was centered on the bullseye or Team D was centered on the bullseye, or both of them were wrong. You don't know the true value, you don't know the truth, you don't know what they were aiming for. But you still know, by looking at the back of the target, that there is noise. You know that they are not all shooting in the same place. And that's a very important insight, because what this tells you is, if you are the insurance company, for instance, you do not need to know what the true value, what the optimal Goldilocks price for the insurance policy should be. You do not need to do that. And that's good news, because you cannot know that. There is no way to determine that price in an optimal way. But you can still know that if 2 or 3 or 4 of your underwriters are pricing this policy very differently, you have a problem and you should try to fix that problem. So you don't need to know the truth to measure noise. You don't need to know whether one of your forecasts is correct and the others are wrong to know that if you've got different forecasts, that's a problem. You can measure noise without knowing the truth. That requires a simple experiment like the one we are illustrating here, which we call a noise audit. A noise audit is an experiment where you give the same set of problems, the same set of cases to a number of different experts, and you measure how much variability there is in their judgments. If you find variability, that is noise, and that will tell you a lot about your processes and procedures. It will also tell you that you need to do something about it. Once you've done something about it, what can you do? There is a sure way to eliminate noise, but you won't like it. The sure way is simply a consequence of the first observation I was making here, which is that wherever there is judgment, there is noise. If you want to say this differently, wherever you want there not to be noise, you've got to eliminate judgment. If wherever there is judgment, there is noise, the only way for there not to be any noise is for there not to be any judgment. And of course, the way to do that is to replace human judgment with algorithms, rules, and other automated forms of decision making. That's why I'm saying you won't like it, because most of us, when it comes to important decisions, like mostly all the ones I've talked about so far, tend to believe that algorithms are a problem. Algorithms are problematic because, as we are all familiar with in the current debate about algorithms, they may add bias or at least embed past biases that human judgments have had. They certainly have lots of other downsides. They may not even be practical at all. And most importantly, they are very unpopular among decision makers who will usually push back against algorithms when it comes to important decisions. So the point of this talk and the point of the book we wrote is not to say human judgment is flawed, let's replace it with algorithms. That will happen in some fields, for sure, and in many fields that will be fine. In many other fields, it will not happen soon, and maybe not ever. So what can we do? What we can do when we want to improve human judgment, not replace it with algorithms, is borrow a page from the algorithms book. What makes algorithms so good, in fact, is not, contrary to what we believe, is not that they have great insight and that they are based on humongous reams of data. That may be the case. But the main feature that makes algorithms perform so well compared to human judgments is that they are noise-free. Algorithms do not vary from one day to the next. The same algorithm is the same algorithm, whereas you would have different individuals making the same decision. Algorithms respond in the same way to the same case. There is no occasion noise and no pattern noise in algorithms, and no level noise if you calibrate them well. So there is no noise. There may be bias, but there won't be noise. How can we make ourselves, when we are trying to be better at our own judgments, how can we make ourselves a little bit more like algorithms in that respect, a little bit less noisy? That endeavor, that aspiration, is what we call decision hygiene. Why do we use this bizarre and slightly off-putting term? Because decision hygiene is a bit like hand hygiene. It's a prevention form. It's a way to not let noise, not let the sources of noise enter into your judgment. It's also a little bit thankless, like washing your hands, because you will never know precisely what mistake you will have avoided. Just like when you wash your hands, you won't know, if I hadn't washed my hands, I might have caught disease X, and you don't even know what disease. Just like that, if you apply decision hygiene, you will not know what mistakes you have avoided, but you will know that you have made your decisions in a better, more disciplined way. Decision hygiene is about introducing better discipline in the way we make decisions. There are lots of techniques and tools that you can introduce to add decision hygiene. I'm just going to illustrate a few, in fact, 4. The first one is to aggregate multiple inputs in order to leverage what you know as the wisdom of crowds. You know the famous experiment where you ask people to guess the number of jelly beans in a jar like this, which is inspired by the classic wisdom of crowds experiment of Sir Francis Galton many years ago. You know that if you take the average of the answers of a large room of people, you will get very close to the correct number of jelly beans. Why? Because their random errors, the noise in their judgment, is mechanically reduced by averaging. So we have the intuition that if we take many different judgments and we aggregate them, we are going to get to a better, less noisy answer, and that intuition is correct. What is not correct, however, is another intuition that we have, and that tends to pollute this judgment. And that intuition is that in order to get to the truth, this aggregation must be done through deliberation. Because when we deliberate, when we discuss, when we get in a room and confront our points of view, we are going to introduce social influence. And social influence does not reduce noise, it increases noise. We're going to have groupthink, we're going to have social convergence, we're going to have hierarchical alignment, we're going to have all sorts of things that in fact do not reduce noise but increase it. If you want to use the aggregation of multiple judgments, the aggregation of multiple inputs to reduce noise, you need to actively manage your process of aggregation to ensure the independence of judgments. In a meeting, if you're going to have meetings, this can be as simple as getting people to write down what they think about the decision at hand before starting the discussion. Or it can take more complicated forms, like getting them to vote and taking the average of their votes. There's all sorts of practical techniques to do this, but the basic idea to bear in mind is you should aggregate judgments by different people and diverse people. That's great. The more diverse, the better. But you should do this in a way that preserves the independence of their judgments before you start discussing them. First idea, aggregation. Second idea, relative judgments. A very simple and old finding in psychology is that we are better at relative judgments than we are at absolute judgments. If I ask you to measure the length of this carrot using the tape that you have here, no two people are going to find exactly the same number because the carrot is not exactly straight and the tape is not exactly straight either, and we may be seeing the inches and the quarters of inches in a slightly different way. So we're not going to find exactly the same thing. But if we compare 3 different vegetables, we are all going to put them in the same order. Apply this to judgments that you make every day. It's quite hard to decide, for instance, on a performance rating. When you decide that a performance rating should be good rather than very good, or excellent rather than very good, or whatever scale it is that you use, this is always a somewhat subjective judgment. When you are, on the other hand, comparing the performance of different people, you will find that there is a lot more convergence in the judgments that people have about the relative performance of people, about the ranking of people, especially if you do it on different dimensions. If you separately evaluate the different dimensions of performance, you will find that there is more convergence, in other words, less noise, when you're making relative judgments. So whenever you can replace an absolute judgment with a relative judgment, it's a good idea to do that. Third idea, and I was already hinting at it in this example, third idea is to structure your judgments, to break down your big holistic judgments into what we call mediating assessments, intermediate judgments, chunks of the big judgment you're trying to make. If you're evaluating the performance of people, you of course know that you should evaluate different dimensions of that performance because there are different things that matter in the evaluation of performance. You probably know that your judgment will tend to be too holistic. There will be what is called a halo effect. So if you want to improve, meaning make less noisy, the evaluation of performance, you should try to evaluate those dimensions as separately as possible, to score them as separately as possible, and only once you have scored them to take an aggregate judgment. A classic example of this that has actually saved probably thousands of lives is the judgment that medical professionals have to make when a baby is born. The judgment that needs to be made immediately is this baby healthy? Or do we send this baby to neonatal intensive care because the baby needs help? This used to be a matter of judgment. This baby looks healthy to me, or, ooh, this baby doesn't look in great shape. Until an anesthesiologist called Virginia Apgar came up with a list of criteria and structured this judgment. The Apgar Score, as it is called after Virginia Apgar, but also after the initials of the 5 things that it scores the appearance, the pulse, the grimace, the activity, and the respiration of the baby. And when healthcare professionals apply this score methodically, line by line to a baby, they do not disagree and they make better calls. Structured judgment is less noisy than unstructured holistic judgment. Apply this to an investment decision. When I happen to work in a venture capital firm in part of my time. When we make a venture capital investment decision, we have a number of criteria. All venture capital firms do. But what we try to do is to evaluate the performance of each investment we look at on each of those criteria separately and to keep those judgments as separate as possible from one another, because we know that our holistic judgment, which of course is very tempting and speaks very loud, is going to be noisier than our evaluation on each of the separate dimensions. So divide and conquer, break down big holistic judgments into their component parts, and you will be less noisy. And of course, once you've done that, after you've gone through all the component parts, there comes a time to actually step back and ask yourself, are we missing something? Is the overall discussion, the decision that we're about to take, the one that feels right? That is the time to use your intuition. Using your intuition is fine if you do it at the end of that process. The problem with intuition is not to use intuition, it's to use it too soon. When you use your intuition early in the process, that blinds you to some aspects of the case that you're evaluating, that makes you more selective to the information that confirms what you already think and less attentive to information that would tend to disprove what you think. You recognize the confirmation bias. That makes you turn reality into a more coherent, more simple picture than it actually is, and that's not good. If you keep intuition for the end, on the other hand, once it has been informed by all those aggregated judgments, by all those relative judgments, and by all those structured judgments, your intuition will in fact help you reach a confident decision that you're making the right call in the end. So 4 simple ideas, again, there are more, but 4 simple ideas. Unless you're going to use algorithms, use aggregated judgments from independent people, use relative judgments, not absolute judgments, structure your judgments to the extent that you can, and keep your intuition for the end. We've covered a lot of ground, and I hope that you have a few questions, and hopefully many questions. Let me just very quickly wrap up what we've covered so far. We've said that noise is everywhere. Wherever there is judgment, there is noise. We don't pay attention to it, but in fact, it is there, and it is creating errors, unfairness, and a lack of credibility in our decisions. It is costly. We should treat it as unacceptable. We should be as outraged about noise as we are about bias. Fortunately, it can be measured, and once measured, it can be reduced by adopting decision hygiene techniques, or of course by automating decisions if you can, which gives us hope that you will take noise into consideration into your decisions and your judgments. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Great. Thank you, Olivier. Really interesting. And perhaps before we do have questions, of course, but before we get to those specifically, maybe just to ask you first how you came to write this book. Because your co-authors, both renowned, especially I think in this circle, are probably Daniel Kahneman is most known to all of us, a living legend in behavioral science, and of course also altered, I think, the course of finance in terms of putting a stake through the heart of the rational Homo economicus. Yeah, but this content now that you've discussed today is moving away from those cognitive biases. I mean, we'll go into this in a moment what the distinction is, but can you just give us a brief look at how you came to write this book together?
Yes, I mean, it took a long time. We spent about 5 years on writing this book together with Danny Kahneman,
who's also quite well known. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Danny and I started, in fact, thinking, this is a topic we should explore. And Danny had written a paper with other co-authors sometime before on this topic, and it hadn't received the attention that he thought it deserved. He was aware that this was an important topic, but somehow this piece of work he had done hadn't received as much attention as it should have. And we asked ourselves why, and what was it that we weren't, that we hadn't captured about noise. And just observing that there is variability in judgment is not enough to get people interested. It's not enough to get people interested. It's also not enough to help them solve the problem. So what we were trying to do was to give people practical tools to deal with noise and to understand why noise is a problem. And so after we spent 2 or 3 years working on this, we came to the conclusion that in fact it was going to be more than an article, it was going to be a book, and that it was going to be a book that wasn't just about psychology or business, but that actually had ramifications in the law, ramifications in philosophy, ramifications in the way society should deal with noise. And that's when we thought of asking Cass Sunstein to join the team, because first, he's a fantastic collaborator and worker and writer, and he's incredibly prolific as a writer, which of course helps, and also because he has a complementary set of skills and a different area of knowledge. So it's actually a very unusual thing for 3 authors to collaborate, and for 3 authors to collaborate with such different skills: a psychologist, a business professor, and a law professor. That sounds like the beginning of a joke about 3 people walking into a bar. But in fact, we thought it was a lot of fun, and we hope the result is valuable to readers.
Well, I can confirm, at least from my side, that it was a success, because I very much enjoyed the book. And since I did read the book, I may have a little bit of an advantage here. And to what actually I had as my question to you, if there were no questions, which I knew there would be, but that is maybe to go a little bit more deeply into this distinction between bias and noise. This is something that in the book, when you first read it, sounds obvious, but you need to think about it a few times before it finally clicks. And once it clicks, then it's quite clear. But I don't know if you'd be kind enough to perhaps provide an example in terms of something we can understand, perhaps economic forecasts or something to this effect, the distinction between the bias and the noise.
Let me try, because it is tricky, and in fact, it seems simple when I describe it like this, but it's actually slightly trickier than that, as you pointed out. Take an economic forecast. Suppose that you have 5 forecasters, and they're trying to forecast the same thing, like what are the sales of your company going to be next year? And on average, their forecast 1 year later, when you know the truth, turns out to have been optimistic. You can say, well, we had an optimistic bias in the company. We should do something about the optimistic bias in the company. That's the average error, it's the bias. But of course, not each of the forecasters, not all the forecasters had exactly the same forecast. There is dispersion, there is variability, there is a standard deviation around the average. That standard deviation is the noise. Now, that's what I've shown so far. Where it gets slightly trickier is this. One of the things that can create noise is the difference in the psychological bias of our individuals. So if one of the all our forecasters have an optimistic bias in this example, but one may be super optimistic in general, and another one may be only moderately optimistic in general, there is a difference in their degree of individual bias. And when you look at a system, the difference in those individual biases produces noise. Similarly, if you think about the example of the judges, it's clear that if one judge is always very severe, or on average very, very severe, and another one is on average very, very, very lenient, that's a different bias of the judges. It's fine to call this a bias. It's probably, in this case, a political bias. And that's a bias explanation, except that the result it's going to produce in the system is noise. So psychological biases, which we think of as producing bias because we assume that those psychological biases are tested in the same lab with the same people looking at the same case and therefore producing the same results. Psychological biases in the wild, in real life, can actually produce bias when they are shared, but they can also produce noise when they are not shared or when they are shared at different degrees. That is the thing that, again, took us a while to figure out, and that makes the link between all the work on psychological bias that you've read and the work on noise that we're talking about now and the results that it's producing.
Okay, I hope that this is helping the audience, because I have to say, as I can only recommend to read the book, then at some point it does click, and then I can't promise, of course, that you have then all the answers, but it makes a bit more sense, this distinction. There's some questions here also, of course, then about teams and decision making. You discussed this idea of the decision hygiene and went through this idea of aggregating, right? And maybe could you again maybe take an example of an investment team, how this could look actually, this sort of best practice, so to speak, for decision hygiene?
So there are many practices, and I don't mean to suggest a best practice, but I'll give you an example of the sort of aggregation techniques in a team that would tend to produce good results. Rather than having the typical format that most organizations seem to have is someone presents a proposal, people respond, discuss, and come to a decision. A slightly better way, a much better way, in fact, would be someone sends a proposal, we read it, and we write what we think about it. And if that conclusion is a judgment, a probability, a price, a maximum price we're willing to pay, or something like that, we actually put a number on it. Then we come to the meeting and we show not just the average, but also the spread of those numbers. And we identify where we disagree. And now we can start a discussion about who disagrees and why. The discussion may reveal that the people who are outliers had actually missed something. And they may say, oh my God, yes, you're right, I hadn't seen that. I'm willing to change my point of view. So then you're going to have a second round where you're going to again look at the dispersion of those judgments. And if you so choose, you don't have to do that, that's a matter of governance, but if you so choose, the average of those second round judgments would probably be a pretty good estimate of what it is that you're trying to estimate. Now, again, whether you want to take the vote, the average of the votes as your decision is a matter of governance. Maybe you want to say, I'm the boss and I'm going to make that call. That's fine too, but at least you will be informed by a process that leverages the diversity of the points of view. If you don't do that, if you do it the traditional way, the problem is you may have all the diversity in the world in your team. If it doesn't express itself because people influence one another, you're not making the most of it. Mm-hmm. So you need techniques like these, which is called the estimate, talk, estimate technique, the one I've just described, or other techniques of aggregation that will help leverage the collective wisdom of your team, that will help make use of the diversity that you have, because it's not good enough to have diversity if you don't use it.
Great. It's unbelievable. It's already time here. We're running out. There are a lot of questions left. I knew that there would be. It has been very interesting. And again, if I can go back to my favorite rational Homo economicus, though, and say that I find this fascinating that behavioral science now, with this ability, of course, to quantitatively measure human error, that in fact, we may actually, with this idea too of decision hygiene, et cetera, come to a point where we're actually becoming again more rational. And so the behavioral finance may become the enabler here of a more rational human. So having said that, very compelling. I'm sure that we're going to hear more about noise. Maybe the last decade was the decade of bias. This decade will be the decade of noise. And we hope very much to hear more also from you, Olivier, going forward on this topic. So I thank you. I thank everyone else for joining. Thank you for your questions. And I wish everyone still a good rest of the summit.
Thank you very much, Susan. My pleasure.